Não sei se repararam, mas na entrada do São Carlos, do outro lado da praça, fica a casa onde nasceu Fernando Pessoa. E por baixo do quarto, da janela do quarto onde nasceu Pessoa, está uma estátua. Essa estátua ajuda-nos a fazer uma ponte entre o tempo de Fernando Pessoa e o tempo de hoje. É esta. E houve uma criança que há umas semanas atrás estava numa visita de estudo e olhou para a estátua do Pessoa e disse: "Ah, este é que é o verdadeiro Facebook." O ontem e o hoje, Pessoa e o Facebook. O sublime e o inevitável. Confesso que me pareceu uma boa ideia para apresentar e para introduzir o próximo debate sobre as desigualdades na era digital e da globalização. O que é que a globalização está a fazer à humanidade? E a tecnologia? Onde estão as promessas da libertação democrática absoluta que encerrava a era dos computadores pessoais? Um computador, um cidadão pleno. Afinal, estarão as tecnologias a cimentar um novo muro entre ricos e pobres, a criar novas classes de desfavorecidos? E a globalização está a retirar milhões de pessoas da pobreza nos países subdesenvolvidos, é verdade, e isso é bom. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, o que está a fazer às classes médias dos, até agora, países desenvolvidos? E como é que está a afastar ainda mais os extremos? Os mais pobres são ainda mais pobres, apesar de serem menos. Os mais ricos são ainda mais ricos. É essa equação que nos vêm trazer aqui os próximos oradores. Branko Milanovic e Richard Baldwin. Milanovic foi economista principal do Banco Mundial, professor em diversas universidades e atualmente na City University de Nova York. Richard Baldwin foi igualmente professor em várias universidades e conselheiro de governos e várias entidades internacionais. Foi economista sénior, por exemplo, da administração Bush nos Estados Unidos e debruça-se sobre a globalização. Sugiro que leiam as biografias online porque são esmagadoras. O debate sobre globalização e tecnologia é moderado pela investigadora Ana Ruth Cardoso, também ela com uma biografia extensa, com passagem pelo Instituto Europeu de Florença, por universidades americanas, espanholas e alemãs.
Welcome to this session on technology, globalization and inequality. This session has a paradox in its background. The history of mankind for many millennia, in part, has been a history of the search for innovations, for inventions that could make our life more comfortable while requiring less effort and less time to produce what we would like to have. And we can think of very faraway examples, such as like when we first managed to transform a stone into a tool with a sharply cutting edge that we could use to cut all sorts of materials. We can think of the invention of the wheel that changed our lives, but we can also think of closer in time examples. We welcome the vacuum cleaner, or the laundry machine, or the dishwasher, precisely because they made our lives more comfortable and they demanded less effort, less time to deliver the services, the goods that we would like to have. And then we get to a moment in time when we say, hold on, robots are about to do all our work, and this cannot go on. If we cannot work, we cannot afford to consume. If we cannot consume, we're no one. So we cannot have machines doing all our work. And so why did we change our minds when apparently we were about to reach perfection in this attempt to have machines do our work? What has gone wrong? Could it be that the problem is not the robots per se, but the property of the robots? if it is concentrated in very few hands that will not share the benefits of the robots? Or could it be that we should try to have an educational system that prepares everyone to be able to create and manage their own robots, on one hand? And on the other hand, should we try to have an educational system that raises citizens who have the values and the attitudes that would make them more prone to share the available work or the benefits of any factor of production, labor, physical capital, knowledge, for example? But going beyond examples, there's two issues that are relevant. One is, how did we get to this point in terms of the interaction between technology, globalization, and inequality? And the other is, what can be done about it? What are the policies nowadays open to the decision makers? And we are happy to count on the contribution of Richard Baldwin and Branko Milanovic, exactly because they can share with us a lifetime of in-depth analysis and reflection on these issues. What have been the mechanisms that have linked technology and globalization and inequality? What can be done about it nowadays? What can we expect to see happening in the near future? So thank you very much for having accepted the invitation. And we will start with Richard Baldwin, so a little more detail, Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. He has previously been affiliated with Oxford University, with MIT, with Columbia University, and currently he is the president of the Center for Economic Policy Research, which is a reference network of over 1,000 economists with its headquarters in London. He's also editor-in-chief and founder of Vox EU, which is an online platform dedicated to inform the policy debate. And he has been advisor, as already mentioned, to many governments and international organizations, including the Council of Economic Advisors of the Bush Senior Administration. And he is a co-author of the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman. So without further ado, I turn the stage to Richard Baldwin.
Thank you for those kind words, Professor Cardozo. Thank you, Anna. Can everybody hear me in the back? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, okay. I guess I should have known that, that's everybody. I guess I should have known that the acoustics would be perfect in this grand setting. What a place to talk. I have to confess that I'm a little nervous standing up here. It's a rather grand setting. But I'm here this morning to try and change the way you think about globalization. I'm firmly convinced that globalization and its impact on society has changed. But most economists and many governments around the world have not changed the way they think about globalization. They are trying to use a 20th century mindset to puzzle through 21st century globalization. What I'm going to try and do in the next 20 minutes is to convince you that you need a broader perspective, a broader way of thinking about globalization, to understand globalization as it has been, the globalization we're experiencing now, and above all, and most importantly, the globalization that's coming. I firmly believe that globalization over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years, will be fundamentally different and very disruptive. Let me start, though, by trying to convince you that globalization changed. This is a graph which has the share of world income on the vertical axis from 0 to 100, and a timeline that goes from the year 1000 up to the most recent years. And I'm following two groups of countries here, India and China, and the G7. The G7 are the big, rich countries, which we used to call the industrialized countries. It's France, Germany, Italy, UK, United States, Japan, and somehow or another Canada got in there. Maybe US was lonely or something, but Canada's in there. If you go back to the year 1000, they only had about 11% of world GDP, but in the year 1000, your share of world GDP, or world income, was your share of the population, because basically everybody was poor and not very far away from starvation. India and China had about half the world's population and therefore half the world's income. And not much changed for 18 centuries. The G7 share went up to about 20%, especially as North America got populated, and India and China didn't change much. And then something radical happened, and we call it globalization. Around 1820, industry and income started to concentrate in the rich countries in an incredible way. Between 1820 and 1990, the share went from about 20% up to about 2/3. Now, as you can see, something changed around 1990. From 1990 to recent years, the share has fallen from about half down to about from 2/3 down to about half. It's back to the level it was in the 1900s. Now, the trouble is, all our thought paradigms, all of our mindsets were developed to understand the green dots going up. And we're trying to use them to puzzle out the green dots going down. That's why I think we need a broader perspective on globalization. Now, I've been writing about this for more than 10 years, and I've boiled it down to its essentials. So here's the simple, broader framework of globalization, which I would invite you to embrace. Globalization as arbitrage. Globalization is the arbitrage of things from one nation to another. Goods, know-how, labor, the list could go on, but I'm going to stick with these three. The traditional view of globalization focuses almost exclusively on goods, and that's what all of our mindsets are about. Cost of moving goods and tariffs come down. Countries start specializing what they do well, they sell and buy more, and that is what globalization is. But technology has allowed know-how to flow across borders in ways that are were never possible, and soon labor. Globalization as arbitrage is constrained by three costs. The cost of moving goods, which affects, trade costs, which affects the cost of moving goods, communication costs, which affects the cost of moving ideas, and face-to-face costs, which affects the cost of moving people. Now, I had these slides prepared. Actually, I outsourced them and had them prepared, so everything is color-coded. When the slides are orange, I'm going to be talking about the second. I hope you appreciate that. It took a long time to do that. So what I'm going to do is argue that globalization, past, present, and future, lines up with these three things. Goods arbitrage is the old globalization. Know-how arbitrage is the new globalization. And labor arbitrage, in particular labor services, is future globalization. So the way I'm going to try and argue that this is the correct way to think about globalization is I'm going to strap it onto the back of a quick gallop through 2 centuries of globalization. I have about 3 minutes to do 200 years, so I hope you're ready. I may skip a few details. Old globalization was triggered by the steam revolution and 19th century peace. Low trade costs make high-volume trade feasible. National competitive advantage makes it profitable. So what we had over here is before globalization, consumption and production were bundled because people were tied to the land. That's what almost everybody did. And if they needed any good whatsoever, whether it was nails or clothing or housing, it had to be made basically within walking distance because it was so impossibly expensive to move everything. Unless you were a priest or a prince or a pirate, you could get things far away. With the low trade cost, you could separate production and consumption and buy faraway goods. And as we know, some countries were better at making one thing than others, countries specialized, and that's the traditional view of globalization. Trade costs come down, trade flows increase, countries specialize, and all the things that are associated with globalization happen. And that's the way most people continue to think about globalization. You'll hear them talk about peak trade or peak globalization, which is complete nonsense, which I hope you'll agree with when we're done. But this is really not the end of it. Something miraculous happened. Production micro-clustered due to communication cost, which led to innovation, modern growth, but the innovation stayed in the G7. So the way to think about this is, before globalization, production was very dispersed. Small world, small production facilities. When trade allowed the world to expand, you had a big world and you got big production facilities, which were concentrated in factories and industrial districts, not to save on the trade cost, but to make it easy to organize and coordinate the complexity that came with these vast scales of production. So as a side effect, production clustered, and that made it easier to innovate. If you could come up with an innovation when you were selling to the whole world, it was really worthwhile. Moreover, you had lots of people thinking about the same things right near each other, so it was easier to do the innovation, and the bonfire of modern growth started. But since the communication costs were so high, those innovations stayed in the North. And the result was the Great Divergence. Between 1820 and 1900, the world we live in today, which is, from an economic perspective, dominated by the fact that there are few rich countries and lots of poor countries, that was created then because the cost of trade came down, but the cost of communication did not. Can you imagine what's going to happen next? Here's a hint: ICT, information and communication. The new globalization was triggered by the ICT revolution, information and communication technology. ICT makes offshoring organizationally feasible, wage differences make it profitable, and knowledge arbitrage begins. So this is the way I want you to think about it. Before the ICT revolution, factories were clustered in big factories in industrial districts to save on coordination costs. I don't know how it's a little hard to see people, but I can see a few gray heads here. When I first became a professor, we organized conferences like this by airmail. So it took a year. You couldn't even think about having a conference if it wasn't a year in advance. You'd send out a dozen letters by airmail, you'd wait 10 days for it to come back, pick up the phone, etc. So think about Bombardier, the Canadian airplane producer, which now makes the tails of its business jets in Mexico and ships it back up to fit into the rest of the plane in Quebec and then sells it. Think about trying to coordinate that with email and fax. It wasn't because they didn't think about it or it wouldn't have been profitable, but it just organizationally was impossible. So ICT allowed the unbundling of production. And that's what we see here. We have ICT coordinated unbundled production facilities, and some of the stages get put into poor countries with lower wages. Now everybody knows about that. Fragmentation, offshoring, outsourcing, slicing up the value chain, many, many different names for it. But all of those focus on the wrong thing. There's a revolution going on in that diagram. It's the light bulbs crossing borders. In particular, when the offshoring happened, the G7 firms took their know-how and combined it with low-cost labor abroad. That completely changed the nature of global competition in manufacturing. Up till now, you had to produce with high wages and high tech in Germany, US, and Japan, or low wages and low tech in places like Brazil, India. Now, you could take high technology and low wages, make it in China, and export it around the world. And in just 2 decades, the G7 share of global manufacturing went from about 2/3 to under 1/2, the most massive quick shift ever happened. That is not the same globalization that happened in the 19th and 20th century. That is not lower trade costs allowing people to specialize in what they're already doing. China and Poland and Mexico, they are not exporting things that they could have exported. They have been taught to produce products by G7 firms, and that has changed the nature of competition. This is how I'd like to explain that, because it's really the first critical change in globalization. So pre-ICT revolution, knowledge is stuck in the G7 nations. So we have these headquarter economies where we have high know-how to labor ratios and therefore high wages. and the factory economies where we have low know-how to labor ratios and therefore low wages. And what the ICT revolution did was open up a pipeline. Global value chains open a pipeline for globalization as knowledge arbitrage, and the know-how could go from the north to the south, and they could still control it. And by the way, it's not actually moving. Since it's knowledge, it's spreading. So Mercedes uses the technology in Germany and in Poland, which then validates the knowledge much more than before. So this high-tech, low-wage revolutionizes world manufacturing. The result is this great convergence. In essence, these handful of developing countries who've rapidly industrialized, they did it because the G7 firms took their technology and moved it in. It was like a fantastic boost in productivity in the manufacturing sector that led to rapid industrialization. That rapid industrialization led to very rapid income growth, and the income growth triggered the commodity supercycle. So a bunch of developing countries who did not get the manufacturing, like say Brazil, Russia, South Africa, Nigeria, they got a free ride on this because the price of their exports went up. At the same time, the volume of exports were going up. Okay, so that's my quick trot through a couple hundred years of history. What I want to do is try and use this framework to, I hope you like that slide. I bought that one. So I thought it kind of fit in well with the theme of today. I wanted to use this framework to explain why globalization seems to act so differently. I actually first did this in 2006 for the Finnish Prime Minister's office when they were thinking in 2006 globalization changed. But anyways, it's still fresh because nobody listened to me back then. So here we go, two really important things. The new globalization breaks the monopoly that G7 labor had on G7 know-how. So before, if GM or Ford wanted to exploit their technology, to a first order of approximation, they had to use American or Canadian workers. What the ICT did is allow them to exploit their technology by moving it abroad, which fundamentally undercut the negotiating power of labor in the rich countries, especially in manufacturing. And this is not just losing a job. For many of the workers in this sector, it just doesn't seem right. That Carrier can shut down a factory, move the whole thing to Mexico, and pay them 1/10 the wage. That's not the way it used to work. That's not the deal. So I think a lot of the anger comes from the fundamental trade-offs among social groups were destroyed by this new technology. The second thing is the new globalization affects economies with a finer resolution. It's not sectors and skill groups anymore. So what I want you to do is look at this infographic here. This is sort of the old globalization. It's supposed to be a factory, an old factory. So there's jobs, manufacturing stage, and product. And in those days, let's say in the 70s and 80s, international competition showed up in your country in the form of a good. So let's take the US car industry. The US car industry was pushed back dramatically by Japanese exports in the 70s and 80s. But that Japanese competition showed up in America in the form of a low-priced, high-quality car. So the reaction was that the entire sector was under stress. The skill groups, the whole GM, the whole Detroit was under stress. And the reactions were that it was a sunset sector, it was unskilled workers in particular, and the reactions that were done by unions and governments and policies were based on the fact that globalization is hitting the economy by sectors or skill groups. Now, oops, sorry, that's another good one. But here's the new globalization. Now, with the fragmentation, the international competition can come right inside the factory and compete with one stage. And here's the disruptive part. Let's say that stage down here, that gets unbundled and outsourced to Mexico. That actually gives Ford cheaper inputs, which makes the other stage do well. So it creates a divisiveness inside the factory, inside the sectors, because the offshoring is giving you lower priced inputs. And now, more recently, it's coming inside for the jobs. So the new globalization impact is more sudden, more individual, more unpredictable, and more uncontrollable. And it's created a sense that no matter what job or skill you have, you can't really be sure your job is next. And I think that created a harmonic in all the rich countries, which helps explain this hesitancy about openness or backlash, Trump, Brexit, on all those sorts of things. So the tornado, I think, is a little bit over the top, but at least it gets your attention. And let me also say that I read a book about public speaking last week, and they told me I should scare you. Because apparently, psychologically, your analytic facilities just flame up when you're scared. It's something, you know, from hunter-gatherer times. But now that I have your pent attention, let me point out that this is also working in your benefit. The people in this audience are the most competitive people, probably, in Portugal. And this is allowing you to exploit your competition abroad. Every time globalization happens, it's more opportunities for a nation's most competitive citizens and companies. And it's more competition for the least competitive citizens and companies. And I'm talking to an audience, I think, anyways, looks that way, of winners. So you can turn all the negative into a positive because this is helping you export your stuff. Okay. Now, I put this slide up. I actually don't know what that means, but it looked cool. And also, I wanted to kind of alert you that from now on, I'm talking about the future, which by definition means I'm making it up. So don't write down what I say. I actually believe what I say. It's a sort of bad habit. It looks like I actually believe everything I say. But from now on, I'm making it up. But what I want you to do is think about the economic logic I'm using. I'm going to take this broader perspective on globalization and take it to the next stage when labor arbitrage becomes possible, and think about what that will do to society. So here's the basic idea. What happens when the third constraint on globalization is relaxed? In other words, face-to-face cost. Three things, I think, in particular. Instant machine translation is changing the world of services. Advanced communication technology is changing the way we can act. And companies are reorganizing work to make it easier to slot in remote workers into the team. And this is happening mostly domestically now. So let me go through those sort of three things. The first one I want to talk about is kind of a schematic of what I'm talking about here. So the digital revolution opens a pipeline for direct arbitration of wages. So here we have the old high know-how to labor ratio, low know-how to labor ratio. And what I'm talking about is a pipeline which will allow people sitting in developing countries, sitting in Kenya, to provide labor services in offices in London without moving. And that will create arbitrage in labor services. Now, those of you who've traveled around the world or look at the statistics know that there's still about a 20-to-1 or 10-to-1 price difference between middle-income developing countries in professional services doing things like accounting and law, doctor, nurses, driving. They're essentially the same services that are done here, but they're paid 1/20th. So inevitable, it won't be quite as good, but it'll be a whole lot cheaper. So what do you think is going to happen? This is something that's happening now, but on a small scale, and all I'm predicting is that it's going to go mainstream. So there are virtual globalization websites. These are like an eBay of international remote work. The biggest one's called Upwork, where people all around the world, but a lot of in developing countries, they list their skills and how much it will cost them, and companies buy those and contract for them, and Upwork intermediates it with the contracts and the payments and the insurances and all that sort of thing. It's going to probably go public this year. It's worth over $3 billion. But there's really many, many platforms like this. So Freelancer, Amazon, Mechanical Turk, Fiverr, and there's a very big Chinese one called Zubaijie, which just recently created an English language version called Witmart. So this will not be like the trade we see now, where you need a huge factory, a container full of goods to make it worthwhile. This will be you and me getting somebody to straighten up our expense report before we send it off, or somebody helping us with the formatting of our slides, for example. These slides were done that way. The second is machine translation is no longer Star Trek. It's for real. Okay, now how many of you saw this episode? How many of you saw it on a real TV? Okay. Those of you under 30, that TV, that's a thing that, never mind. So anyways, they've been accused of a terrible crime, and they're being tried, and they, of course, can't understand the foreign language, so they have this little gizmo, which is automatically translating what they hear into their language, and when they speak, it gets translated. Now this is what it actually looks like today. It's called Pilot, and it uses a little earphone which connects with your iPhone. So this is not science fiction. It exists. Last year, there was an enormous breakthrough in simultaneous machine translation. First at Google, but Amazon and others have done it. So if you go on your phone and download Google Skype, Portuguese is not that good, but if all the main languages is quite good. You can either read a sign, you point it to China. I was in China last month, and you could point to simplified Chinese, and it appears in English immediately. And you can speak into it in English, it instantly translates it to Chinese, you press the button, and it speaks Chinese to the other guy, and it goes back. So that exists. It's pretty amazing. On Skype, there's an option called Skype Translator. So if you download this, and you go onto Skype, and you want to talk to somebody who's speaking French, you turn on the translator, you speak in English, the guy hears you in French, he speaks in French, and you hear him in English. This exists, it's there, it's on your laptop right now. YouTube auto-translate captions. So many of the foreign language, what I would call foreign language videos, have this option. So you go to the little gear, go to captions, and it will say auto-translate. And what's going on there is the computer listens to the language, automatically translates to English, and puts English captions under the video as it's going on. So this is not science fiction. It actually works, but most people don't know about it yet. Machine translation transforms global competition in service sector. There will be an absolute talent tsunami. So this is a picture of the famous devastating tsunami in east of Japan a few years ago. Now what happened there was the earthquake raised the seabed by 8 meters, and therefore the sea by 8 meters. So it wasn't a wave. It's just the sea level rose by 8 meters, and it was like a 100-kilometer river coming into Japan until it evened out. Now think about what instant translation would do. Let's say there's 7.2 billion people in the world, and let's say 2% of them are gifted. That makes 140 million gifted people. Generously speaking, only 30 or 40 million of them speak English. Next year, another 100 million will be speaking English. Your companies will be able to hire people who do what you do for a whole lot less. Just take China alone. China graduates 8 million university graduates. Most of them are unemployed and work for very low wages, Dubai and other things like that. Next year, the year after that, they'll be speaking good enough English to do lots of stuff. The year after that, it goes very fast. This, by the way, Portugal will be shielded a little bit by this, because it's not just computing power. They need enormous data sets for this. And the real breakthrough was the UN put all the matched sentence-by-sentence translations into the 6 major translations going back to the 1940s online. The EU Parliament did the same. The Commission did the same. The Canadian Parliament did the same. So if you have one of these enormous data sets, the computers are already very good at translating it. Portuguese probably has less machine hand translation. Okay. This is advanced communication technology. I won't go on that. It's not revolutionary, but it's getting revolutionary. And what I want to end with is the holy cow moment. That's not the technical term, but... Now, on the vertical axis, it's progress. And on the horizontal axis, it's years. Now, focus first on the blue line. This is how walking distance minds think about the future. Our brains evolved to think about motion when something really fast meant an arrow traveling through the air. So we almost inevitably extrapolate in an arithmetic, in a linear way. So something gets developed, and they landed on the moon, they'll be colonizing Mars. And everybody, oh, they're going to colonize Mars. But that's not the way technology works. Technology follows an exponential curve where it doubles every so often, let's say 18 months or 2 years. And since it starts to zero, almost nothing happens for a long time. But then the increments get incredibly large. And you pass the arithmetic, and all of a sudden you go, holy cow, and you start underestimating the impact of technology. So just to give you a very, I'm out of time here, but just to give you a very quick example. So this is the iPhone 6S. And it is more powerful than the computer that sent Apollo 11 to the moon. Do you know how much more? 10,000? A million? The answer is 120 million times more. Now guess what the difference is between this thing and the iPhone 7? Another 120 million times. And guess what the difference between this and the 8 is? 240 million times. So the thing is, the increments in technology are just going so fast that they surpass our ability of walking distance minds to figure out what's going on. And I think this is going to change the nature of globalization, and simply to point out that this globalization is happening at the same time and by the same digital laws that the automation you talked about is. So in the next few years, the service sector, not the manufacturing sector, but the service sector, I think, will experience enormous disruption because of globalization and automation. So I'll just stop right there. That's the angry people, and there's my book. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Richard, for a very informative and also provocative intervention. And we move to Branko Milanovic, who's visiting professor at City University of New York Graduate Center, and he has previously been affiliated with the World Bank Research Department, with the University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins University, and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. Currently, he's a scholar in the Luxembourg Income Study, and he's a member of the advisory board of the network Academics Stand Against Poverty. He's a fellow of the Center for Global Development in Washington, and both his books and his participation in the social media informing the policy debate on inequality and globalization have been ranked as very influential. So please, Branko.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to first for the invitation. It's really a pleasure always to come to Lisbon, particularly when the weather is so beautiful. And thank you for coming to listen to us. Now, my slides, as you will see that in a moment, have not been outsourced. So they are very primitive, actually. And now I've learned from Richard that the next time I'm going really to send them to the countries where actually they do them much more efficiently at lower cost than what I do it myself. A lot of that is based on my book, Global Inequality, which is also translated in Portuguese. But there are also parts which are not based on that and which maybe to some extent will be in, I hope, actually, in my next book. So let me start with something which is also in the long term, and you will see actually that many of the themes that Richard mentioned, and we are really pretty complementary, I think, would be reflected in inequality statistics at the world level, precisely in a very similar way to what he explained. Now, two things which I would like actually to point out, which are to some extent obvious, but I think we should think of them. First of all, why is the current moment, and I take it as a current moment last maybe 3 decades or 2 decades, why is it a unique moment? It's really the first time, I think, in history that capitalism is the sole sort of mode of production or political social system that rules the entire world. It does sound kind of both clear and sort of intuitive and kind of weird, but until even during Globalization 1, we had still slavery in some parts, very sort of feudal serfdom type of regimes in many countries, and then we had communism. And now all of that is gone. Actually, if you look for a very sort of a strict Marxist, but also Max Weber's definition of capitalism, all countries today are capitalist. So there is actually no other mode of production but that. There are some maybe peripheral modes of production here and there, but China is as capitalist, or actually in some respects even more, than the United States. So I think this is something which is very new, which actually never existed in such a way before. The second thing which is also new, which is also mentioned in both presentations today, is that shift of economic power from Europe, or from the actually northern countries, Europe and North America, into Asia. So what was something which was called by Angus Madison the resurgent Asia. Now, what is actually interesting, so this must be one interesting point there, is that we are going back, and I will not sort of expand on that, we are going back to the distribution of economic activity which existed, let's suppose, around 1500 in Europe. Actually, around the time maybe when Portugal started with, you know, maritime explorations that really changed the world. And if you look at that, you actually have now recapturing by Asia, principally by China and India, but also Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on, of the relative economic power which they had 500 years ago. Now, obviously, it is now happening at a much higher level because everybody's income has gone up, and they have not yet caught up with the developed or G7 countries. But if we sort of project, I think not unreasonably to the future, we might expect this to happen in the next 30 or 40 years. And I will go, I can tell you, can tell obviously many things there, but think of the very fact that China now has a GDP per capita which puts it at the level of the poorest EU members. And that also is kind of a little bit misleading because actually urban China has an income level which puts it towards the European median. So this is a remarkable transformation in only 40 years. This is something which obviously we have never seen in history, particularly if you have in mind that we are talking about more than 1 billion people. Secondly, which is interesting, and again I will not expand on that, is that we have a very interesting process to which actually Richard alluded, which is disarticulation in the north. For those who might remember the literature of the 1970s or the 1980s, there was this view that the south actually is characterized by disarticulation, meaning that there is a small group, compradour bourgeoisie and others, who are linked and they are included in the globalization process, but everybody else, like peasants, farmers, people who are slave-defined, self-employed, they are working in a traditional economy and they have no contact with the sort of globalized world. Well, strangely enough, we have now the similar phenomenon in the richest countries because of the disruptive nature of globalization and the fact that some groups of people, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, are really quite comfortable, doing very well, and their skills are being really rewarded very highly. But large segments of the population, Richard mentioned them, for example, factory workers and others, are left out. So it's a very peculiar change that actually we have the processes which we associated with the developing countries now taking place in the advanced countries. And then likewise, you know, the greatest support today for globalization is in the south, not in the north. Recently, Pew Research Trust, which does these very interesting polls, had a question about support for globalization. The highest level of support was in Vietnam. The lowest level of support was in France. This is not something that if you were to be sort of guessing 30 years ago, you would have said. So the world in that sense has really changed quite dramatically. And I will show you now the numbers, how it looks in terms of inequality. But before I do that, and I will not have the time to expand on that, I want you also to think of migration, which is such a hot topic in Europe and to some extent in the United States, as a really reflection of globalization taking place under conditions of uneven mean incomes. That means the following. If you have globalization taking place when countries are rich and poor, there is obvious advantage to people moving to a richer country, whether they move there physically or they move, as Richard says, actually by being able sort of virtually or at long distance to accomplish the jobs, they do affect the labor market in the rich world. But that only happens because of the two conditions. One, that you are able to do that thanks to globalization. Two, that there are large gaps for arbitrage or large gaps between the wages. So let me then go through some of the reflections of what I just said on global inequality. Now, global inequality is inequality between world citizens. It's a long story how you calculate it, because you have to do like massive work with household surveys, now also with fiscal data more recently. And you have to also adjust for the difference in purchasing power. So I just want to assure you this was done here in the sense that actually you have to adjust for the fact that a given income in India is going to buy you more than in Portugal, and in Portugal €1 or euro equivalent will buy you more than in the Netherlands, and so on. So it is all done. So what you see there, without discussing it too much, is that the vertical axis you have the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of inequality, which goes from 0, sort of theoretical state where everybody has the same income, to a number 100, theoretical state with only one family or one person would have the entire income. So what you notice there is that with Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West, there was an explosion in global inequality. The reasons are very simple. You think of the past world as essentially a world where the differences in mean country incomes were small, and then you had a big bang of the Industrial Revolution that set some countries, Western countries, into the sort of long path of growth. And actually, if you think of the rest of the world as India and China, their incomes did not rise very much. So the increase of inequality within the rich nations also contributed to that rise, but the main sort of momentous change was the change in relative incomes between the West and the rest. And as you can see, this continues. There are some sort of slowdowns during World War I and the Great Depression, and then we reach a plateau. And this is the world that we are still sort of thinking of, because this is the world where the West was dominant, significant and large differences of income. The competition was essentially a trade competition. But then around the turn of this century, something else happens. It started even earlier, of course, with Chinese remarkable growth from 1978 onwards, but then it sort of catches up with India, with Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth. So then we have a sort of a reversal of the first industrial revolution reflected in inequality data. So we have this very peculiar situation, to some extent paradoxical, but it's not paradoxical because obviously it does exist in the world, of rising inequality within each nation, driven very much by the factors that Richard explained, and also Pierre actually spoke very eloquently about that before. So each nation becomes more sort of heterogeneous, disaggregated. People are affected, some favorably, some unfavorably, and inequality leaps increases significantly. China, for example, had a much higher increase of inequality than the United States. Sweden, the paragon of equality, had a very large increase in the Gini coefficient. Obviously, US, UK, Russia, Ukraine, practically all the countries, with few exceptions in Latin America, had an increase. But then what happens at the global level? The high growth rates of hitherto relatively poor countries are sufficiently important to offset that effect and actually to lead to a decline in global inequality. So if you were to project it into the future, you can actually sort of think that we might go back in about 50 years or so, we might go back to the level of global inequality which existed in the beginning of the mid-19th century. But that level itself is not sufficient for us. We have to understand what is behind that level. And behind that level, even arithmetically, but also politically, are two causes. One, which is in gray color here, is inequality within nations that I already mentioned. It is inequality in the past between capitalists and workers, feudal lords and peasants, and so on. And the second, the red part, is inequality between the countries. I mean, that's very clear to us, that's inequality between Poland and the UK, Morocco and Spain, Mexico and the US. And what happened during this process of the first globalization and the process of the rise of the West was that the location, the red component, became very large. So in other words, what happened is that within countries you have a reduction of inequality, but most of inequality really was due to location, to the fact that you were born in a poor country or you were born in a rich country. It had many political implications, including, I think, it did away with this sort of notion of proletarian solidarity, because if you have vastly different incomes, if you're in the bottom 10% in the UK, and bottom 10% in China, or in bottom 10% in Indonesia in 1920, there is not much of solidarity that you can have if the gap of your income is 5 to 1 or 10 to 1. But then, in the future, and this is not the world that we are in yet, but it's the world towards which we are moving, we will have the shrinkage of this locational component, the red component, and probably the widening of the within national component. So really, the message or the bottom line there is very mixed. It is a good message that the world is becoming more even and less unequal, that the differences between us are becoming less. But the bad part of the message is that differences between us and people who actually matter to us, which is generally speaking our co-citizens, and people with whom we share the political space are increasing. And this is something which is very difficult, I think, to sort of absorb and to accept, because there is a sort of a breakdown between the political space, which is the national space, and between the economic space, which is global space, and becoming much more so. So what has happened then over the last 25 years is that you had, for the first time, global income distribution, which is shown on this graph in 1988 and then 2011. It has changed very significantly. Now, for you, so many of you who have not seen how national income distributions look like, they look very much like this red line, where you see the number 2011. They actually have a certain smoothness. They are very long in the upper tail because you have, rich people, lots of rich people, and it's a very long upper tail. But they also have the middle class. Now, what you notice that here is that in 1988, the blue line did not have the global middle class. It was actually an empty space, generally speaking. And for the first time, I think, in history, or at least in the last 2 centuries, because before that we really cannot say much, we actually have something which looks like the global middle class. It's not the Western middle class because people are significantly poorer, but it is in the middle of the global income distribution. Now that contrasts very sharply with the exactly opposite movement which you see at the level of nation state, which is the decline of the middle class. And this is something that we all know. And for example, here I have like 4 countries, Germany, US, UK, and Canada, and this is the share of the 4 deciles in the income distribution, the middle people. So everywhere they go down. And this is not something which is happens in the US or UK, where we actually wrote the most about that. This is happening everywhere. This is happening in Finland. You take the same statistic, you look at the share of the middle in those countries, and what you notice, they are shrinking. So we have again the reflection of the same sort of conundrum of on the one hand, growing global middle class and shrinking national middle classes. And it raises, I will not go into that, but raises, of course, a political issue. In the past, we believed, and that's how all our theories are basically becoming obsolete, we went through the modernization theory of Lipset and so on, and believed that the strong middle class in a nation is indispensable, necessary, and helpful for the growth of democracy. So now we have the shrinkage of this middle class in nation states, which, if we go by that theory, is not good for democracy. But we have a growing middle class in the world which does not have any governance structure to reflect itself. There may be actually that they are going to consume things more similarly to each other, but there is no governance structure at the world level, and it's actually unclear what global middle class would mean in the future, today and in the future. So then I come to something that has received quite a lot of attention, which is yet another way of representing the phenomena that I talked about, and this is the so-called elephant graph. With some imagination, you can sort of see the elephant there. Some people were able to put different types of elephants. There are also disputes whether the elephant is the best animal to represent this, but having said that, let's try to explain what it is. So what you have on the horizontal axis, you have the percentage, your position in the global income distribution. So number 1 would be the poorest 1%. Number 100 would be the global top 1%. So the higher the number, the richer you are. And on the vertical axis, you have how much your income has risen over the period 1988 to 2008 here, or now we have the numbers all the way to 2013, so there is not much of a change. I'll show that in a minute, but this is the graph that I always use, so it's easiest to explain based on this 20-year period. So what you notice here very clearly is, without sort of going into all the details, is that in the middle of the global income distribution, you had the largest increases. On average, it's almost doubling, but many groups, because the data come as national deciles. So if you're like, suppose the third decile in urban China, in 1988, you were better off than 23% of the world population. Well, 25 years later, you are better off than 55% of world population. So this is what I call the greatest reshuffle of individual incomes since the Industrial Revolution. So imagine these people like cards sitting from the number 1, the poorest, to 100. So in 25 or 30 years, somebody who was here, relatively close to the bottom, has actually jumped over a large segment of the world population. But because these are relative positions, the problem there becomes now for the rich countries, and this is the point which is illustrated here, which is the trough of the curve, where we actually did not see almost any growth on average, or very modest growth, real growth. And when we look at the people who are there, they are overwhelmingly 70% of the people in that group are people from the high income, advanced, old OECD members. Old, I mean, not including the transition countries. If you include them too, then you get to 90%. So essentially, these are the groups of people that, of course, many have noticed have been affected by globalization. Now, what was also interesting, their relative position, and actually when you look at the rich world, and you look at Portugal or any other country, really the whole thing about inequality that we talk about happens at that point around, up from the 70th percentile to the top. So that's really where the populations of the rich world reside now. But that does not mean that they will be there in 25 or 50 years, because if this long march through the world income distribution continues, they would be actually pushed in relative positions down. That has not happened so far, because the Chinese long march has been incredibly important, but it has started from a very low point, so it has moved towards the middle of the distribution and somewhat higher, but it has not reached in massive numbers the part of the Western income distribution. But that's where it will come. So there are two things which I think may be sort of projected in the future. Further absence of growth among the lower parts of the income distribution of the rich world, plus their relative downgrading in terms of the percentile where they are in the global income distribution. And then, of course, at the top, and I will stop there, at the top you see, of course, very large income growth of the top 1%, or actually the top 5%. So essentially what is also, I think, contributing to the malaise that we see in the rich countries is that that group in the middle, which has not seen any growth, or very little growth, is squeezed. From one hand, it is squeezed from the competition of people essentially in Asia, but maybe gradually and increasingly from Africa, who can do the same jobs as they do at a fraction of the price, and with whom they are competing also through trade, through outsourcing and so on, and then from the top 1% of their national income distributions. So this is this articulation at the level of rich countries that I talked about. So let me then essentially finish again with, one hand, a very sort of encouraging cosmopolitan message of reducing income gaps between countries and people, and the creation of the global middle class, and the difficulty of political absorptions or resolution of these somewhat hopeful facts because of the political space which is really organized at the level of nation state. Thank you very much.
Very nice.
Thank you very much, Branko. Given that we're so used to think about income distributions within countries, it's fascinating to have this global view. And so we learned that if we take this global perspective on trends in income dispersion, the trends are not as pessimistic as when we looked inside countries only. And we also learned that part of that trend has taken place because firms in developed countries were willing to transfer their technology, their marketing, their management, their knowledge to developing countries to combine them with low-wage labor. So at this point, let me try to raise just two sets of questions before we turn the stage to the audience. One relates to what we can expect to see in the near future in terms of jobs located where, which type of jobs. So one scenario could be if we think that China has already surpassed the US in terms of the number of patents that are registered and granted, and also South Korea is doing very well in terms of registering innovations. One could imagine a situation where the center of the world in terms of knowledge creation moves back to where it once was, to Asia. And so we could see Europeans or North Americans knocking on the door of Asia or other countries, asking them to allow us in as immigrants. Is there any feasibility in such a scenario? Or an alternative one is we'll all be working remotely, so it will not matter whether we live in China or in Portugal, we will be living in one and working in the other one. Any other scenario that you find feasible? And then the second issue relates to the policies, the policy options, and at which level should they be implemented, national, more coordinated? Should we reinforce policies that worked well in part of the 20th century, like taxes, transfers, strengthening the redistribution of income, the welfare state? Or can one claim that redistribution of income only corrects the symptom, and therefore one would need to redistribute endowments, the physical capital, land, possibly, if we look at trends in the prices of urban property? Or is education still a very promising policy option, going back to the introduction? And how do you see a policy that seems to be very popular nowadays in some countries, some sectors, which is to go back to tariffs and restrictions on trade, on flows of goods? What can that do to jobs in the home country in a setting where knowledge flows have become so important and it's no longer a matter of just goods flows?
Good. I start. Let me see. Future of jobs. I think the first thing to do is to stop using the recent past as a predictor of the recent coming years, or the years soon to come. Most of globalization and automation, which has led to a lot of these problems, has been in the manufacturing sector and in the agricultural sector. And those happened in a certain way, and those sectors have been in turmoil forever. But this next globalization, and the automation as well, is coming to the service sector, people who have office jobs and things like that. So I think the impact on jobs will be in a very different place. It's not factory workers losing their jobs, it's going to be office workers losing their jobs because of the technology and because of the direct competition. So that would be my sort of first thing, is we have to think that the coming globalization will be different. Now, the globalization of the manufacturing sector will continue as before. That's not going to stop. It'll be a trend. I mean, the employment share in manufacturing in the developed economies is on a mission to zero. It's just going down, and it has been for a long, long time. But now it's going to come to the service sector. And let me make I think, reflecting upon this, I think the fundamental difference between the globalization we're experiencing now and we will really boils down to physics. So manufacturing and agriculture, they make goods, and that's governed by the laws of physics of matter. Mm-hmm. The service sector is all about information, and that's the physics of electrons, which is completely different. So if I told you, for example, world trade flows would double in the next 2 years, you'd just laugh at me, because it physically would be impossible to move goods like that. But if I told you that the amount of information crossing the internet would double in the next 2 years, you would say, yes, of course, everybody knows that. But information is really services. That's what services are, for most services. And so fundamentally, the constraints on the old globalization won't affect the new globalization. That's why I think it's coming so fast. I don't know if you want me to touch on the other things, but...
If you want very briefly.
So the policy response, I'm glad I'm actually writing a new book. Thank you for letting me plug my new book. And the working title is called The Globotics Upheaval. And globotics is globalization and robots smashed together in an ugly but hopefully memorable word. And it's to sort of make this idea that the globalization and the automation of the service sector are coming at the same time. Now, the reaction to that, I mean, the policy is, I think, first of all, give up on trying to protect jobs, because we're in such a turmoil. Everything's changing and moving around very, very fast. And you should protect workers, not jobs, like they do in Denmark, for example. When somebody loses their job for whatever reason, aging, climate change, globalization, automation, the government's committed to helping them move. And then the second is to package it politically. I think especially in the US and the UK, we've gotten away from the idea, and this was part of Pierre's comments too, the idea that the society is responsible for making sure everybody feels that they may actually win from this thing. And if you remember in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, even in the United States, the social welfare system advanced along with globalization. For the last 2 decades, globalization's been advanced, but the social welfare system has retracted. And in countries like the UK and the US, they've had big problems, where in countries like in Europe, Canada, Japan, it hasn't done that. They've had much less problems.
That's a good hint to
well, maybe can I just continue on what Richard said? So I would just like to say a few words about what I see with the welfare system in the rich world, sort of changing. First of all, I think actually when you look at the past, the big equalizer or the big tools for equalization or redistribution of income, I think, have now become much less effective, and it will become even less so in the future. And then very briefly, the big equalizers were actually education, mass education. Many European countries started after the World War II with like 5, 6, 7 years of education, went up to 13 years of education. You have a plateau there. Not everybody wants to go for 16 years. Not everybody should go. So you have actually, you gain a lot. There was big bang for a buck for a while, like Brazil is gaining now, because the skill premium goes down as you have more educated people, but that cannot really continue any further. Secondly, trade unions, or trade union density has gone down. I don't need to elaborate on that. Actually, this ironic situation that now, of course, trade union density is higher in the public sector than in the private sector. Actually, activities that started is in opposition of workers to private capital is now really an activities which are much more common, opposition of workers to the state, because the private sector trade union density has gone down. And I think there are good reasons, including the change of the dominant form of employment, and the fact that actually we don't have Fordist system anymore, but we have really many service sector with small sizes of units, and this will continue. So this is not going to be used anymore. I mean, to the extent it was used before. And then the last two were taxation and transfers. What we see with taxation and transfers, we see that despite the rhetoric which started Margaret Thatcher and so on to limit the increase of the welfare state, it has not gone down, but it has not gone up. The willingness to continue, actually the taxation in most countries have gone down. So really I don't see people being willing, with the exception of some possible taxes on, for example, inheritance, which I believe should be reimposed, but we don't see the willingness to have your current income taxed. Furthermore, with globalization, it is becoming more and more difficult. And finally, social transfers. I think there also, if you don't have more taxation, you cannot have more of them, but also there is the issue of migration. There, perception, whether it is true or not, that migrants are attracted by high welfare, successful welfare countries, is also changing, I think, the welfare rules. And it was something I just mentioned even 30 years ago in Sweden. And whether it is true or not, there are disputes on that. But even if it's not true, the perception is there. And secondly, if it is not true, that's because many migrants are still young, so they're not actually using some of this. So I think these are all actually coming to their limits. And what needs to be done then, in my opinion, is, as you mentioned, is actually change in endowments. So in other words, if we have really more equal endowments of human capital, not only number of years of education, but quality of schools, that's where public universities come into the game, and if we were to implement measures for what I call the deconcentration of ownership of capital, because we have forgotten how extremely concentrated the ownership of capital is. We are talking about the Gini coefficients above 90 in most rich countries. And this is like twice as high as the concentration of labor income. And we have not done anything there. So this would be my actually view that actually we should move toward equalization of endowments, not redistribution of current income.
Thank you. So I think it's time we give the audience a chance to ask questions. If you could briefly state your question, then we would have time to take more questions.
Raise your hand.
Thank you. My name is Bernardo Cruz. I'd like to follow up on your question, on your original question, Professor Cardoso. There's a lively debate on attributing to every citizen guarantee income coming from the work of machines to make sure that society will still be buying and selling once machines take over most of the jobs and moving into the services. There's another debate coming out of foundations in Latin America on swapping the logic of working and the time of working versus the time of leisure. My question is, first, can we support, can we finance a universal income that would offset the impact of automatization in the workplace? And the second one is, can we as a society learn to have more time free than working, and how we will reorganize our society to be of a leisure society, not a working society? Thank you.
Thank you. We can take a couple more questions and then combine the answers. Otherwise,
let's do this. And
okay. I think part of the question is going to be probably addressed in more detail this afternoon, I suspect. But
so if I can start. So I think the concern is absolutely valid. It's probably not for the next 5 years or 10 years, but certainly automation is advancing because computers are learning to think. And they have very narrow types of thinking. It's really, I think artificial intelligence should be called almost intelligent rather than artificial intelligence. But they're very good at some narrow database pattern recognitions, and that's expanding. That will replace lots and lots of jobs. So ultimately, it's like Star Trek, 25th century, nobody works. Now, our entire system is job-based capitalism. Almost everything about the economy, the taxation, the spending, is based on your job. And when the jobs go, we're going to have to find a different system. So if you think about feudalism was a system where the owners of the land decided what's made, who makes it, and who gets it. Then it shifted to capitalism, where the owners of the capital decided those. When robots are making everything, we'll have to find a different way of doing it. So there's no doubt that we will have to fundamentally change the system to get this income out to people to buy the things that the robots make. That's clear. Now, I think you put your finger on the financing, because in this job-based capitalism, a huge amount of the revenue is based on job taxation, one way or another. So even if the number of jobs fell by 10%, there would be a serious hole in the budget, exactly when we would need more money for universal basic income or other things. So I don't know where that's going to go, but it may ultimately involve redistributing the means of production. That's an old solution. But, I mean, if the income distribution gets narrower and narrower, and their political power prevents extreme tax revenue, extract rates, we'll have to find a different way. So the second is, can we work less? So one of the things I've noticed about people is, maybe you're the same, I'm the same, I spend way too much time doing really nice tweets and Facebook posts, and I don't do videos, but I think people would love to spend less time at work and do creative things that they do. So I look around me, and most people I know, their real passion is for things that they don't work. It's for doing other things, and they just want the accolades of their friends or friends online. And so I have no doubt whatsoever that if we could all work less, we would find something useful to do in our lives. But that's not going to happen overnight, but I'm hopeful that way. Plus, just watch Star Trek. If you watch enough Star Trek, but it's a documentary, right? It's not science fiction.
We can take another couple of questions from the audience.
Hi. Good morning. I wanted to ask a question about the Baldwin's pipeline, now of the flow of knowledge between countries. And the thing I was, when I saw that was like, there are a lot of externalities that come from the technology flowing from one country to the other. And one other thing is, rich countries have kind of a monopoly determining which knowledge passes to the others, because it's mainly for production purposes. And my question is the following. In terms of the other part, so the thing that is not positive externalities, so are the other basic infrastructure left behind? How can we prevent that from happening and not having just positive externalities in technology and good things and only the things that the rich countries want? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There was one question there, I think.
Hi, just a quick question. Since globalization can be seen as a global problem, why is there a lack of an appropriate response from the global governance in terms of institutions like the UN and other, and even in terms of discussion? There's just lack of policy at a global level.
Do you want to start, Branko, or Richard?
I will be brief. Let me just say one thing to the first question, because there I have a very kind of different view, slightly different, somewhat different from Richard and many, maybe other people. I actually don't fear very much for jobs. I first think that actually that people who fear that take our current bundle of needs as sort of final, because that's what we've been doing that for 200 years. We cannot sort of visualize other needs which still don't exist, because the, as Steve Jobs said, rightly, people don't know what they want until we give them. You know, when I was young, there was no internet, and I didn't need internet because it didn't exist. So, you know, we might actually say today nobody feels a huge need today, it's a weekend, to fly to the moon, to spend nice afternoon, and maybe walking on the moon and looking at the other planets, Earth and the others. But because such a technology doesn't exist. So I believe that when we say the jobs, we will spend lots of time having leisure, I think that takes out two things which I believe are fundamental. And that is that our wants are endless, insatiable, so we want always more and more, and the technology would provide such new goods, services, things which we don't know exist today, and we cannot want them. So in that sense, I'm not worried. I think we would have jobs to do, and I actually think that many people don't even want to have leisure, because for many of people, work has become actually producing more utility than leisure. And the link between the two, I mean, the difference between the two has really become much more vague, and they're really sort of merging into each other. So that's where I'm much less pessimistic on that point. On global governance, I think this is too much of a bite. You know, of course we have global institutions, you know, WTO, World Bank, IMF, Bank for International Settlements, ILO, we have all this alphabet soup. But you know, to have a global governance would imply such a tremendous change. I mean, if you look at the European Union, which is actually the closest that has tried to do that, problems that they have within a fairly homogeneous environment compared to the world. So I would not expect this happening anytime soon.
So Richard, your experience on this?
Yeah, so let me just pick up on that last thing. I mean, if the title of my book is The Great Convergence, and as you saw the thing, there was, 20% of world GDP share shifted from the rich countries to the poor countries. And so globalization has been an incredibly divisive thing internationally, very good for some, very bad for others, and no global governance has the ability to do the kind of redistribution to make it. And they are talking about it all the time, but there's really just nothing they can do. I agree with what you said there. On the jobs, let me just react. I think the direction of travel is right. I do believe in human creativity to recreate jobs. What I'm worried about is that the next 3 to 5 years, 10% of the service sector will lose their job, and a harmonic will come that's anti-technology, that a sort of neo-Luddite movement emerges. And in the 2020 elections, the US presidential election, the big enemy is technology, not foreigners. So that I'm a little worried about the speed of travel, not the direction of travel. On this, on the sort of externality thing, I don't think we're any longer in a world where the rich countries are dictating things. As you saw the graph, we're back to the 1900s in terms of share of GDP and technology. And one of the great successes of India and China has actually been to capture this initial push with technology transfer and turn it into an industrial base that's absolutely fabulous. And they're starting to create all sorts of own products. So they have taken the next step, they've lifted off, and it's no longer tied to the developing markets. So I think they're in control now. The world's completely different.
We have a few more minutes, a couple more questions.
Hello. My question is for Professor Baldwin. You spoke about the need to repackage globalization in order to get people to work with globalization instead of against it. How do you suggest we do that?
So let me give you, oh, sorry, we're going to take some questions. Yeah. No, I think
we can take another couple of questions and then answer them jointly.
My question relates to the challenges of managing what we have now, which is a globalized economy, with mainly local democracy, so local systems of government. And as we've learned today, we are getting more and more globalized. And what you have is people working maybe from home, remotely abroad, and thinking about issues abroad, while their systems, their political systems, if they are even democratic, are mainly local. My second question would be regarding this third wave of labor globalization. What are the limits to it? Are there limits to labor globalization, or can we reach a fully globalized world in which most people are working abroad, or it is as likely for them to work abroad as it is to work in their home country or city? Thank you.
So exactly 2 minutes to...
2 minutes. So managing the global economics with local democracy, that's the great puzzle. I don't have a solution to it.
I don't have either, so we have answered that question.
The third way, what's the limit? So face-to-face is still really important. And people do work remotely. Many of you will telecommute a couple days a month to your office, but it's still not as good. So I think what the limits are is the fact that human contact, in-person contact, is still irreplaceable and necessary for many things. So it won't go that whole way. And the same thing with the artificial intelligence, is these things can't do lots of things that humans can do. And if we're going to prepare for this new world, we ought to think hard about what is really important about in-person contact. And you ought to get your children to develop their skills in things where they actually have to be in the same room. And when it comes to competing with artificial intelligence, they have to develop skills that this narrow AI, which is getting so good so fast, can't do. So it's all database pattern recognition. It's not how do humans get together, manage teams, empathy, creativity, identifying problems. So that's how we have to adapt to prepare for it.
Can I just say something on the issue of movement of labor? And that's something that I mentioned in the talk, but didn't have obviously time to go into that detail. But essentially, you have the current situation where you have large gaps in wages or incomes between poor and rich countries. Now, you can actually arbitrage, as Richard says, that in two ways. One way, people in poor countries stay in poor countries. They work according to sort of long-distance virtual connectivity and from the rich countries, and it doesn't create migration problem. The second one is actually people move. And I think that the two effects would actually exist at the same time. Now, with increased migration, we face the problems that we already talked even before, and it is the problems of absorption of migrants and all the problems that you know quite well. But I think that requires for us to think creatively about how to deal with migration. And I think one way is to learn something from the Gulf countries, which have a migration which is limited in time, so-called circular migration, where people go, get jobs, stay there for 4 or 5 years, and go back to their country. So to answer the question, yes, we can imagine the world where people would be really working in different countries, but they still would not stay in that country where they have moved forever. And the second thing which is required is dilution or change of our concept of citizenship, which is currently a binary concept. When you're a citizen, you have all the rights and benefits and duties of citizenship, or you're not, and then you have zero. If we have actually migrants with different ranges of citizenship rights, for example, obviously job protection would be the same, but welfare benefits would not be available. You can have a situation where you cannot bring your family. You can have a situation where migrants would be taxed more than the local population. So there are things that where citizenship would become a continuous variable rather than being a binary. But that's really a major change in our way of thinking and the organization of nation state.
So we finish on this note with a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much to the audience. Thank you very much to the speakers. It was a pleasure to have you here.